Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bounds. On today's show, we're covering the release of two fascinating and revealing new documentaries. Both take a sideways look at men we're familiar with from their hugely public and vastly different profiles. One as a world leader and the other as an icon of Hollywood's golden age. This duo of documentaries are real exemplars of the craft, creatively lifting the lids on people and worlds we think we might know and taking the audience on riveting journeys of discovery. We'll be getting under the skin of both films, oh so very different, up ahead in this episode, so do stay tuned. First up, the Bibi Files takes as its extraordinary source material footage of police interrogations of the highest echelons of Israeli government and society, with a special focus on Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In the footage, Netanyahu repeatedly denies allegations of bribery and corruption, while police interviews with witnesses, including Israeli billionaires and their employees, describe the steady stream of gifts flowing to the Prime Minister and his wife Sarah, who is herself an explosive character in this film. The footage is supplemented by a cast of fascinating talking heads: a childhood friend of Netanyahu, a journalist, the former head of the Israeli security agency Shin Bet, and others. Altogether, director Alexis Bloom paints a portrait of one man's fight for political supremacy and survival and its devastating consequences for Israel's democracy and the war that's killed and displaced tens of thousands of Palestinians in just the last year. I spoke to Alexis about her film The Bibi Files and began by asking when she first knew the scale and intrigue of the source materials.
Well, Alex Gibney approached me last summer, so it was probably July 2023, and said that he'd been leaked these tapes. He was approached on Signal by somebody who said, "I have some material, do you want to see it?" And Alex, being a long-term investigative journalist, gets a lot of messages, and some are legitimate and some are not legitimate. But to his credit, he always sort of tugs on the thread. So he tugged on the thread and found it that to be true, that somebody had very interesting material and they were the leaked tapes. And he brought them to me and he said, "Are you interested in doing this? We're not quite sure how much is there. We don't know what it all means. It's all in Hebrew. Have a look and let me know." So that's how it started. It was before October 7th. And I've always been interested in Israel. I've been there, on and off my whole life. And I've worked there before. And it was clear that the material had something in it. You obviously having police interrogations with, Benjamin Netanyahu, Sarah, Yair, and their inner circle is going to be fascinating. I knew that anyone making a film about Bibi probably wasn't going to get access to him unless it was a total puff piece, unless you could convince him it was a hagiography. But this was the closest thing to having access, is having these unfiltered, unmediated interviews with the police.
Yeah, I mean, we see Netanyahu, before the interrogators come in, sort of pacing around his office, twiddling his thumbs as he's waiting for people to turn up. Most of the points in the film are entirely guarded, despite there is your forensic filmmaking, fantastic talking heads as well. But some of the most telling moments, perhaps when the Prime Minister lets down his considerable poker face, you might say, are on the moments sort of between people walking in and out of the room. You've decided to keep those in. I'm guessing that these are kind of serendipitous moments for you as a filmmaker as well, perhaps.
They are, and we had a whole bin of things, quiet moments, we called them, where people are just, on one of the interrogations, he has a terrible cold and he's, mopping his brow and using his nose drops and blowing his nose a lot. But actually, you kind of have to resist that as a filmmaker and be judicious about it, so you're not... Even if you disagree with a person, you're not being unfair to them. You can tell by the film that I disagree with the way he's running this war, deeply, profoundly. But you don't want to take cheap shots, I guess. So we kept a little bit in, so you see the humanity of the situation and you understand that time passes, because some of these interviews are 4-5 hours long. So it's not people talking all the time. But we try to keep it to a minimum.
Yeah, no, I mean it's fantastic stuff, and I wanted to ask also. I mean, as I said, you've got these phenomenal talking heads, but the sort of meat and potatoes of it are certainly at the beginning of the film is the sort of intimacy of these interrogation tapes with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with his wife Sarah, with other members of staff, former staff as well. And I wanted to know how it felt to kind of when you started watching these tapes, when you saw some of the things that were revealed, how it felt to you, because the structure of your film is a really interesting one. You start off with what we might call the petty corruptions of cases of boxes of cigars and cases of champagne, and we see how those small corruptions lead to large-scale ones, and perhaps some of the reasons why this forever war, quote unquote, is still being waged as we speak. So I wanted to know how you felt about putting those bits in at the beginning and seeing where that river led to.
I was fascinated to see, the variety of charges that the investigators presented to the Netanyahus. And some were small and some were big, but they were all connected. So in terms of my decision to start in quote unquote small with cigars and champagne, it was an effort to show this kind of web and how, I call it like noble cause corruption. It kind of spreads, right? If you think that you are the state and the state is you, what is $250,000 worth of cigars and champagne? It's nothing. I mean, that's why I say quote unquote small, because actually it's not that small. But it feels small because it's cigars and champagne. And then you see it sort of slowly drift in this web towards bigger things like controlling websites and then calling everybody else a liar, and the lies sort of snowballing. Then they get bigger and bigger. Then the lies kind of enter your politics. People who you wouldn't have your photograph taken with 2 years ago become your legitimate coalition partners. And the smile that Netanyahu gives when he's shaking the hands of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir when they join his government is as big a lie as his denial of the cigars and champagne. It just has more serious consequences.
Yes, and you show that, Alexis, in incredibly supple ways in the film. And as I say, there are people, you have former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, you have former heads of secret services and military services, you have Raviv Drucker, who is a TV interviewer and TV producer as well. Most potently, perhaps, at least to me, was one of his old mates that he grew up with and that in fact knew his brother. And you go into the story of his brother, and perhaps that's a sort of bit of a foundation myth, the gun that started the race for Benjamin Netanyahu's political ambitions. But you go right back to his best mate when they were children, and he comes on the record for your film, The Bibi Files, to tell the real story of his ex-friend, we can now presume. How did it feel having an interlocutor like that on tape, speaking with such affection and such sadness about his old school friend?
I felt incredibly privileged to have these people participate because Netanyahu is still prime minister. No sort of insignificant risk to them. It's not like they're talking about somebody who is long gone. He's still their prime minister. And I regard it as an honor that they agreed to talk to me. Uzi Bella, who's his childhood friend, is a fantastic person with, sort of palpable integrity. He's almost everything Bibi isn't. That's how I felt making the film. And in fact, when I met him, I thought, wow, you've been friends for so long, and you're so different. Uzi is an oncologist. His patients adore him. He's considered a real sort of titan of his field. And he's really humble and really sweet and, has a lovely wife and was very sort of personable and humble, for want of a better word. So getting somebody to talk like that who clearly had no axe to grind, he's not involved in politics, felt to me like an important voice to include. Everybody has humanity. And, you may support their politics, you may abhor their politics, but everyone has humanity. And it's important in filmmaking to try and sort of access that. And Uzi allowed us to get at who Bibi was when he was a kid.
Yeah, and I sort of touched on it, that Netanyahu's younger days as a politician, where he was an ambassador, and he became quickly known as you tick this off chronologically in the film, Alexis, that, and you show how good he was as a TV performer. He would go to television studios all over the world and have these memorable lines, and would have these kind of three very strong kind of topics that he wanted to hit home on certain issues. Did you get a sense from looking at these interrogation tapes that Netanyahu's sort of brilliant sort of Barnum and Bailey-ness as a TV performer was there in those interrogation tapes, or did you see moments of humility, honesty? What did you see? Did you see him ever forget that there was recording equipment in the room with him?
Benjamin Netanyahu, the television personality, is absolutely connected to Benjamin Netanyahu, the subject of a police investigation. You can see him performing. You can see his comfort with it. It's almost his happy place. However, the interrogations, the conversations that they have are long. So even for a consummate performer like Netanyahu, 4 hours in, it's like the Olympic Games to keep up that facade. And he does crack. He does get angry. The mask slips. He pulls himself together again afterwards. But the Israeli police challenge him again and again, sometimes asking him the same question 4 or 5 times. So occasionally, even he struggles to maintain this kind of half smile, I call it. That's how he is. And then, but he deflects when he can't charm. He deflects. So he just says, I don't remember. That's it. That's a huge thing. I mean, there's a little sequence that we cut together of I don't remembers. And it's, people were like, oh, that's too long in the film. You should cut that down. It had started at, we cut together like a 2-minute sequence of I don't remember, because I wanted the audience to feel as tortured as the police interrogators must have felt by the continual invocation of I don't remember. But actually my editor was like, no, you can't do this. It's just not fair to the audience.
The film has these, as we said at the beginning, these kind of incendiary moments. It is a gripping affair, but it also has a sort of a necessarily slow burn quality. You have to show where Netanyahu came from, what Israel might have been before him, what is going on, obviously, in this war now since October the 7th last year. How would you describe the pacing of the film, Alexis? Was it important to have these high points, these explosive moments in the film, but for it to have this controlled and sort of patient air to it?
When I started the film, researching it and looking at the material was pre-October the 7th. So it was a completely different film before October 7th. Once that happened, it became apparent that everyone was going to think about when they thought about Israel was the war, and was, October 7th and Gaza, the connection between the two. And so we knew we had to get there. The question then becomes, how do you connect the trials to that? How much trial can an audience take before you get to contemporary Israel? And it's a calibration. The two are connected, but there's an impatience, I think, on the audience part to get to today, because today is so gripping. So we had to leave a lot of the interrogations on the cutting room floor. There's loads more. Had October 7th not happened, we could have made a film with a lot more interrogations, I think. But we had to get to the consequences of this trial because they were getting increasingly serious, and we couldn't ignore that. So the film became this kind of this domino structure where you start with the investigation, then the indictment, then Netanyahu getting into bed with the extreme right, so Supreme Court, October 7th in Gaza. And we knew that, right from the beginning, we had this sort of gamut to run.
And just finally, Alexis, I mean, you started off making a film about corruption, and now you are making a film about a war being waged as well, almost necessarily. It will be inspected within those parameters. And we're talking right at the end of November. Last week, the International Criminal Court made its infamous judgment on Netanyahu and the defense minister of Israel as well. You start off with an artifact, and you're now holding a kind of stick of dynamite, it seems, doesn't it? Does it feel that much more live to you as a filmmaker now talking about this film, that it's almost, that it's on a fuse?
It's always felt tragically relevant. I wish it wasn't so relevant. It's odd to be in the position talking about this, and as a filmmaker, you think, on the one hand, you think, great, my film's so relevant. And really instantly, on the other hand, I feel I wish it weren't so relevant. I would like nothing better than for him to leave office and for people to say, oh, this is an artifact. It's past, it's gone.
Alexis Bloom there, director of The Bibi Files, and that's in cinemas on the 13th of December. And now we shall duck away from the political arena to a more wholesome spotlight. Bogart, Life Comes in Flashes, is a new documentary directed by Kathryn Ferguson in collaboration with the estate of Humphrey Bogart, for it is he that the camera in this tender but very revealing film irresistibly turns to. Yes, we see that retinue of gangsters and wise guys, private eyes and gumshoes, raffish rakes and bow-tied suitors, but Bogart the documentary also shows us the man behind the scenes. The striving actor, the complicated character who sometimes played simple ones, the son of wealthy but distant parents, the wavering husband to 3 wives before he met Lauren Bacall, and finally, the family man. We get some great Hollywood lore from clips of Katharine Hepburn and John Huston, intimate reflections from the late Lauren Bacall, and contemporary comment from the son of that famous Bogart-Bacall romance, Stephen Bogart. And it's Stephen we spoke to put the man, the legend, his father, into focus. And I began, maybe in the wrong place, by asking Stephen what he learned about himself and his father in the making of this documentary.
Why do I have to always learn something? That's my question. Everybody says, oh, what did you learn? Was it emotional? It was not emotional. I learned some stuff. I learned why he went to the Navy, because his mother said that. But I didn't, I've been living this for 75 years. So it wasn't really a learning experience. It was an awesome documentary experience, I think. I learned that he was kind of driven to succeed. And he was an iconoclast, and he was kind of a trailblazer in his own way. But I think I knew that. So, I learned a little bit about Mary, and about Helen, that stuff. I knew the stuff about my mother, and I knew a lot of the stuff about Mayo because I'd done some research, even though I'm not a student of my father's life or films.
Yeah.
It's not really for me. When you make a movie, I don't care what kind of movie it is, you're not making it for yourself. I'm sure there are a lot of lousy movies that the director, the producer, wow, this is pretty good. And people think, no, it sucks. So it really doesn't matter what I feel. What matters to me is how unique it is and how different it is, and how it's not like any other documentary that I've seen, not only on him, but on any star of his caliber.
At what point in making the film and actually in rewatching the film, Stephen, did you kind of feel like you were watching someone you didn't know on screen in terms of your father? Because as you say, there were people in this film that he was married to before your mother. There were aspects of his career that were clearly not always successful. I wondered how much you kind of essentially, I don't want to use the word learnt again, but there were parts of you where you kind of felt, God, am I looking in a mirror here or whatever?
No, it wasn't like looking in the mirror, but it was very interesting to find out what he was like in his youth. He was only married to my mother for, 13 years or something like that, or So yeah, it's 13 years. But it was very interesting to me to see like how he hooked up with Helen. You know, he was just a stagehand guy, and somehow, you know, he wasn't like 6'2", and you know, he wasn't Kirk Douglas kind of guy. He was just a but he seemed to have this thing. It's kind of what I saw about him going on the way, along the way, and coupled with the history of the times that he lived in. Because, you know, the time, I mean, the 10s were World War I, and then there was the Roaring 20s and the Depression and World War II. So he had major stuff in each decade of his life. And it was interesting to see his metamorphosis through the eyes of Kathryn, and through the actions and how he reacted to his the women in his life.
Yeah. And I mean, through the documentary, you obviously see the progress of the man as the actor, your father as the actor. And you see how manners changed through the early and then the middle years of the 20th century. It's for me, that was an amazing thing to see from these kind of these comedies of frippery on Broadway, and then they were mimicked in the Hollywood of the 30s. So then your dad becoming this kind of hardcore, hotshot kind of, you know, guy with an attitude on screen at least. It was a kind of an amazing, for scholars of film, I know that is an amazing journey for them to go on, watching the progress and the career of your father. What did it look like being his son and watching those things back? And again, I know you're not a scholar of his work, and neither should you be, but it must be interesting to see him go through that metamorphosis, I guess.
Yeah, it was. It's very weird that he ended up where he ended up, considering where he began. You know, he almost didn't make it in Hollywood. Then he said, all right, if I ever get back out there, I'm going to stay there. And then he got into the whole gangster thing. And that was a good thing for him. But there were a lot of people, you know, Jimmy Cagney and people like that, you know. And then the film noir stuff came around. Again, there were other actors. There were the Fred McMurrays and, you know, with Barbara Stanwyck, a great movie. And but he kept also making great movies, and he had an eye for a script, and he had an eye for people who really were talented, who were not actors. Those were the people he hung around with. You know, the Houstons and the Nunley Johnsons and the Noel Cowards and all of these types of people. So it was an interesting change through the decades as to how, but it was on the, I think he was kind of in love with Mary Phillips, because he did want her to stay in California, and he did want to have kids with her, but she wanted to be on Broadway. So it was a wild and wacky time for him. And somehow, some way, he ended up he got High Sierra, and that started the change, because he hooked up with Houston and all that.
I wanted to kind of go back to the genesis of the film, Stephen, and just ask you what you and Kathryn Ferguson, the director, kind of talked about with the overall aim of it. I feel like it's so strange to say, but aside from the amazing back catalogue of movies, Humphrey Bogart has not been delved into hugely, at least by documentaries.
When I spoke to Kathryn first, you know, she went to Universal and she pitched the idea. I was not keen on the idea. I was like, another documentary. Are we going to go movie, meets my mother, movie, dead? That's been done 8,000 times. I was going to do it. But when she came to me with her take, and with her unique take, and what she wanted to do, because my partner talked to me and said, these guys want to do a doc. And I said, well, let me look at her previous one. She did the Sinead O'Connor documentary, which was fantastic. And I watched that. And then I talked to Kathryn, and she gave me her vision. And, you know, I said, you know what, Kathryn, let's just do this. Let's see what we come up with. I still didn't understand how it could be really as fantastic as it is, because he's been dead for so long. There's nobody else to interview, blah, blah, blah. She did an unbelievable job. Maybe we'll get nominated for something.
Yeah, you deserve to. It's a very subtle retelling of a story.
Right. And even the guy, Kerry, who played my who voiced my father.
Yeah.
He couldn't be, we didn't want an impressionist. We didn't want someone to come up and try to sound like him, but he couldn't be that far away that it would be distracting. And he did just such a perfect job. And even the music just fit right in.
Yeah, I love the music. And I looked for the music in the credits, and it was by The Unloved. And I tell you what, there are so many unsung credits in features and in documentaries. And I absolutely love the music. And it's so not contemporaneous to your father's career, and yet it seemed to totally fit somehow.
Yeah. Kathryn said, I'd never heard of him before, but Kathryn said that their bent was they like to do 50s kind of music, 30s, 40s. That was their bailiwick, and it was fantastic. And not enough people have mentioned the music.
No, I thought it was stunning, and I'm glad you mentioned it, Stephen. You and Kathryn obviously deserve to go the distance with this wonderful film. And I wonder, as you say, there are many films that have been made about your dad, but what is your takeaway from this one? Did it take you somewhere that others haven't? I wonder if you feel, actually looking back on your own life, that there are similarities, that there are rails running alongside each other, Stephen?
I don't know about that, but this one was entirely different because it was unique and it was new, and it wasn't just a cookie cutter, or let's make a bogey documentary and we can show the movies and blah, blah, blah. And that was what was really important to me. It's, my life and his were different, but we had the same idea. I think he didn't, kind of wanted to get away from things, and he didn't want to, he was a loner. I'm not a loner, but he chess is a lonely thing, and acting's a lonely thing because you're not yourself. And certainly sailing's a lonely thing. So he was kind of like to be alone. That's not me, but I'm sarcastic, and he was too. That's the big one. That's what my wife would say.
Stephen Bogart, son of Humphrey there. And that is all for this week. My thanks to Alexis Bloom and to Stephen Bogart. Bogart, Life Comes in Flashes, is out on the 9th of December, and the Bibi Files is out on the 13th. And you know where to look for streaming options for these two fine works of non-fiction. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, and Steph also edits the show. We'll be back at the same time next week, but until then, from me, Robert Bounds, thanks for tuning in.